Hi, so this week's topic is the Jeffersonian era. So we're going to talk about Jefferson through Monroe, which I think does go a little bit further than your book, but I like to kind of end this first part of class with the War of 1812 and its aftermath. So we're going to go through Monroe. So where we want to start is the election of 1800. One of the ugliest elections in our history, pitting John Adams against Thomas Jefferson. Um, it was brutal. The men, as I mentioned last time, will not speak to each other for a really long time. They accused each other of just about everything you could think of. But ultimately, Thomas Jefferson will prevail. Now, one thing Jefferson and his faction, what will eventually be known as the Democratic Republican Party, they wanted to make sure they didn't have a situation like the last time where Jefferson wins, but then John Adams gets to be vice president because he comes in second. And so they basically got together and they decided who their vice president was going to be. And that was going to be Aaron Burr. So all the electors for Jefferson all voted for Burr to make sure that Burr would become vice president. Well, there was a problem with the system. Jefferson and Burr ended up with the same number of electoral college votes, which meant even though the obvious intent was for Jefferson to become president, that by a strict reading of the Constitution would mean that since they tied, it has to go to the House of Representatives. Now, Burr probably could have stopped all of this and said, I'll be vice president. But Burr is a very kind of interesting figure in American history. He was definitely up to something. And so he's probably thinking, yeah, I could be I could be president. That would be awesome. So it goes to the House of Representatives through several votes. Eventually, Thomas Jefferson wins the presidency, actually thanks to Alexander Hamilton, of all people. Even though they had, I think it's a lesser of two evil kind of situation. Also explains the duel that Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr will eventually have here. I'll have a special presentation of that for you. So what's important here is this is the first time in American history where one faction loses and will transfer power peaceably to the next administration. And Adams, we really do owe him for that. And one thing he will do is he will keep nominating judges until the time he leaves the White House. He was the first to live in the White House, making sure that Federalists will have a control over the judicial branch for some time to come, even though their party will be in decline. So Jefferson has a different view, and we'll see this in the video, Assume the Position. You may have watched it last week. It'll be mandatory this week. He did not like the pomp and the circumstance. He's going to decide to be called Mr. President. He's actually going to answer the door himself in slippers, which is kind of embarrassing for our country. One thing he will do, he is definitely a Southern aristocrat, so he will throw elaborate dinner parties. He spent $2,400 a year on wine. That's, I don't know, seems kind of hard to do that today. Jefferson was definitely a son of the Enlightenment. If you've ever been to Monticello or Monticello, however pronounced it, you should check it out. You could see kind of his interests on display. He was interested in archaeology. He defended liberty, but he owned slaves. He probably had an affair with Sally Hemings. We're pretty 100% sure on that. So, he is a contradiction in a lot of ways that we'll see. This is also a time where duels were very popular. That's how men, gentlemen will decide, some of their conflicts. I'll actually have more about dueling when we talk about Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay after the test. Remember, we'll have our first test be due nominally the Friday of fall break. I'll be posting that later this week for you with some instructions. The most famous duel during this time was probably Vice President Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton on July 11th, 1801. As I said, I'll have that for you. Hamilton will be killed. Burr will flee. The charges will eventually be dropped, though Jefferson. So that's kind of the first problem that we're going to have with Aaron Burr. Jefferson, when he comes in, the first thing he wants to do is shrink the size of the government. But he did not make wholesale changes. He felt like the states retained most of the power in the federal system. He told his Secretary of Treasury to eradicate the national debt and to sever ties with the national bank. The government sold its stock in the bank. He relied on Western land sales and tariffs to fund his government. He slashed the size of the Army and the Navy, which will be a mistake, though the Federalists will still control the courts, as I said. Now, what's going to happen is Adams made all of these appointments. So basically, what you had to do if you were an appointed judge, you had to come and present your credentials to the Secretary of State. And they were still coming after the inauguration of Jefferson, where basically Jefferson told James Madison, his Secretary of State, to stop admitting them and not accept their credentials. This will go to the Supreme Court, Marbury versus Madison. Marbury wanted his judgeship. Madison tried to say no. And basically, what the court decides, the Supreme Court says, you have to honor the appointment and that the Supreme Court will be the arbiter of what is constitutional and not constitutional. So this is where the Supreme Court actually takes the power that it has now. Now, it doesn't really push it too far because it doesn't make the ruling mandatory, but that's kind of that first step in grabbing that mantle of umpire that the Supreme Court and the judicial branch has today. Originally, a lot of people actually saw the judicial branch as the weakest of the three, but here the Supreme Court under Marshall is saying, no, we are a co-equal branch of government. This is what our role is going to be. We're going to be the umpire. This is also a time where we began having trouble with the port of New Orleans because we don't have steamships yet. For western states, Kentucky, Tennessee even, it was easier to send things down the river through the port of New Orleans. So if we're having problems with New Orleans, which is under French control at the time, then that could be very bad for our commerce. So what Jefferson is going to do is he is going to send delegates to France to maybe buy New Orleans from Napoleon. Well, Napoleon, they really caught him at the right time. Napoleon really at one point did have some designs on an empire in the New World, but he's also trying to fight a war in Europe, and he could use the cash. So basically what Napoleon does is he offers to sell the United States what is the entire Louisiana territory, which is basically the middle third of the country. Now, according to the way Jefferson saw the Constitution, this was technically illegal for the government to buy land like this unless there was a constitutional amendment. And what Jefferson actually wanted to do was to pass a constitutional amendment that just simply said the United States buys the Louisiana Purchase from Louisiana from France for, I think it's $11 million. Might be 14. See a couple of different figures. There was that stupid Capital One commercial that was just stupid a couple years ago. So basically what his advisors told him was, this is kind of one of those deals we got to hurry up and we got to take it. Napoleon could change his mind, though technically Louisiana territory belonged to Spain, but whatever. We'll settle that later. Um, and so Jefferson, even though he believed that it was unconstitutional, he bent his own beliefs and he bought Louisiana Territory. Excuse me, which means basically he's a hypocrite. But it would be kind of annoying as every time we added territory, we had to do a constitutional amendment. You know how long those take. So this will double the size of the country. In January of 1803, before the purchase, he has sent Lewis and Clark on their famous expedition. He wanted to get information about geography, animals, plants. He also wanted to negotiate commercial treaties with Indian tribes. But now it has a new purpose to the expedition. They're now going to tell people that they are in America. So, and Jefferson had a very paternal view of Native Americans. He thought that he had to treat them like he was the father and they were children. He also encouraged in those commercial treaties, he wanted the Native Americans to buy things from the country on credit so that when they couldn't pay, we could take their land. So in that way, Thomas Jefferson is a jackass. So Lewis and Clark go out on their expedition. They have a French translator and his Indian wife, Sacagawea. I used to have some of the Sacagawea dollar coins. Maybe you did. We used to have dollar coins. They wanted to let others know this was a peaceful expedition, so they're not going out in force. So, Jefferson wants to go out, civilize these Indians, take their land, that kind of thing. Some tribes will assimilate while others will resist. We'll see how well that goes. Soon we'll be talking about the Trail of Tears. In the 1790s, we had seen an Indian revival movement where they had wanted to cut ties with the white men, including alcohol. Among the Shawnees, there had been a prophet. His name had been Tinskawatawa, Tinskawatawa. We're just going to call him the prophet. He wanted to bring back traditional culture to Native Americans. He told his followers to reject Western ideas, and he was very militant. He joined with his brother Tecumseh and created the Pan-Indian Resistance Movement, uniting 6 tribes to fight white encroachment in Ohio and Indiana. They would use force to protect their land. Well, 1804 comes along. Jefferson runs for re-election, wins easily. His second term will be much more challenging. That's kind of the way it usually works. The second term is usually pretty hard. He wanted to use the tool of impeachment to get rid of some of the Federalists in the courts. And he targeted 2 judges. See, that's one power that the Congress has is in other branches of government, judicial and executive, if someone needs to remove, we have the power of impeachment. That's actually a simple vote in the House to impeach, and then it takes 2/3 of the Senate to remove. So you can be impeached and then not removed. Obviously, we have seen that a few times, haven't we? For presidents, but it happens for judges somewhat often, about once every 10 years or so. So anyway, what the Constitution says is that to be impeached, you have to be guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, and it's kept vague really on purpose. So he's targeting 2 judges. First thing he did was he removed Judge John Pickering of New Hampshire. He was a drunk, but probably had not committed high crimes and misdemeanors, but he was probably pretty incompetent, so that one was okay. Next, he targeted Samuel Chase. You might remember him from the 1776 musical. He was partisan, but not corrupt. So many began to question the use of impeachment in this way. Some argued that it was a tool to check unelected judges. Chase, however, was not convicted, and it caused dissension between Jefferson's radical and moderate supporters. And fortunately, it stopped the use of impeachment as a political tool in this way, because if it had started here, every president would impeach judges that they just didn't like, and that would, I think, be bad for the system overall. Aaron Burr continues his political shenanigans and schemes. He will be charged with conspiracy and treason, though we're not entirely sure what he was up to. Again, if you're looking for a paper topic, conspiracy theories about Aaron Burr are very interesting. He possibly wanted to raise a private army to conquer Mexico, or he was raising a Mexican army to invade American territory so he could set up his own country. Jefferson wanted him prosecuted for treason, but Chief Justice Marshall refused to interpret the treason clause more broadly. The government has to produce 2 witnesses to treason, and they just couldn't do that. I can imagine that conversation, Jefferson, the strict constitutionalist, Marshall, the one who probably wants to look at it more broadly, is probably like, so now you want me to interpret it loosely. I see. Burr will eventually go into exile in Europe. By 1803, Britain and France were at war again. Jefferson wanted to use peaceful coercion. He wanted both of the sides to purchase our commerce. So what he wanted to do first is to deny our trade to both sides. He passed the Embargo Act of 1807 to keep Americans' ships out of harm's way, but smugglers obviously, tried to go around that. It was very unpopular in New England and seaports. Exports fell from $108 million in 1807 to $22 million in 1808. Jefferson even had to send troops to the Canadian border to enforce the embargo, something he had imposed in earlier administrations, so he again looked like a hypocrite. So 1808 comes along. Jefferson's like, screw it, I'm done. Washington only did 2 terms, I'm only doing 2. And there's a split among the Democratic Republicans over who should follow him. James Madison was Jefferson's choice. He was the architect of the Constitution, drafted the Bill of Rights, had been Secretary of State. Other choices were former anti-federalists George Clinton and James Monroe. Clinton really went nowhere. Monroe did have support, and actually he'll be next up. Democratic Republican congressmen met in caucus, where they chose Madison as their candidate. This was the first presidential caucus. George Pinckney will run as a Federalist. It was closer this time, but Madison wins the Electoral College 122 to 47. He immediately probably wishes he hadn't. He inherits a foreign crisis. Britain opened talks to end the embargo, even said that they would pay reparations for the Chesapeake incident, where they had seized an American ship and actually shanghaied basically the American sailors into service. They even agreed, the British did, to stop searching and seizing American ships in neutral waters. The British government, however, kept undercutting the negotiations and basically ended any hope for peace. Congress now looked for a solution. They put together a select committee led by a man named Nathaniel Macon, M-A-C-O-N. He proposed to allow French and British goods back into the U.S. ports if they came on American ships. That was voted down. He did pass what was called Macon's Bill number 2. That said, when Britain or France repealed its restrictions on neutral trade, the U.S. would then put an embargo on the other country. So Napoleon promised to respect our rights of neutrality, and really he did this to drive a wedge between us and Britain. So basically he's like, I gave you what you want, slap that embargo on Britain right now. This obviously made things with Great Britain a lot worse. We also blamed Great Britain for recent Indian attacks, Tecumseh. They had actually sold arms to Tecumseh and the Prophet. After a series of treaties like the Fort Wayne Treaty of 1809 took away 3 million acres from the Delaware and Pottawatomie Indians in Indiana. William Henry Harrison will actually lead a military expedition to hunt down and burn to the ground the village of Tippecanoe. That forced Tecumseh into a formal alliance with the British, where they began to set up their attacks. This is a good place to end video 1. Next up will be the War of 1812.